couple of hours later, the ballet goes on and the music goes on Radio Moscow, and we're thinking of getting the bosses out of bed. On comes all the announcements saying that Gorbachev's been deposed and a new council of ministers has been put in charge, and that went mad.
Welcome to Cold War Conversations.
Massive Soviet military forces have invaded the small, non-aligned, sovereign nation of Afghanistan.
5, 2, 7, 1, 6, 6, 9, 8, 3.
Good evening. The stunning overthrow of Mikhail Gorbachev by communist hardliners dominates the news this Monday. Gorbachev was reported under house arrest as Soviet tanks took up positions throughout Moscow.
And I'm here to host this final program from the German Democratic Republic of Sweden.
We speak today with Alistair Coleman, who joined BBC Monitoring as a technician in 1989, just in time for the fall of the Berlin Wall. He was on the console night shift at Caversham on the night of the coup against Soviet leader Gorbachev in 1991 and describes that night as the highlight of his career at the time. Before we start, I'd like to thank Andrew Adolfson, Rick Mason, Mike Smith, Aid Bryant, Ole Bjørsvik as the latest members of our select band of supporters who are helping us financially just for the price of a cup of coffee a month and help keep us on the air. They will shortly be the proud owners of a Cold War Conversations coaster. Don't you want one too? Just go to patreon.com/coldwarpod. That's patreon.com/coldwarpod. Back to today's episode. Alistair spent 15 years in shortwave radio, radio telegraphy and satellite reception and research, providing the signals for monitors and editors to see foreign media. He tells a fascinating story of how many countries obtained information about activity behind the Iron Curtain. We welcome Alistair Coleman to our Cold War conversation. Alistair, how did you get recruited by the BBC?
Quite by accident, of course. I was a computer operator for motorway tyres and accessories.
That sounds glamorous.
Yeah, doing all their stock taking and everything. This was 1989, so it's a long time ago. It's a big mainframe thing. And the BBC, who were working in Reading for the BBC Monitoring, were after computer operators for their new computer, which was the same make as the one I was working on. And I applied, and after 3 interviews later, I was starting end of February 1989.
And so where were you based? Where was this?
Yeah, this is BBC Monitoring. It was and still is part of the BBC News division. It was part of BBC World Service then. It's in Caversham. Was in Caversham Park, just outside Reading. Big mansion on the top of the hill outside town with a huge 10-meter satellite dish, which one day I would be operating myself. So yeah, it's basically on the skyline in Reading, and everybody knows it's there. Right.
And how old were you when you joined them?
I was the boy engineer then. I was just 23 then.
And what role did they recruit you into?
I was literally a computer operator. It was a brand new computer system. I started there just as they were dumping typewriters and going into a huge mainframe text handling system. So yeah, so they just needed somebody who could like change backup tapes and stuff. It was one of those big old-fashioned mainframe computers.
Yeah, no, I remember I was involved in computers in the late 80s, and they were like massive washing machines. And
yeah, we had 13 of them all working together.
And can you just describe what BBC Monitoring did then? What was its purpose within the BBC?
Yeah, BBC Monitoring still is. It's open source, so it's listens and watches foreign broadcasters for news output, anything that can give an insight to a foreign nation and how they're acting. Just before I joined, 1986, our Finnish team broke the news of Chernobyl to the world. It was broadcast on Finnish radio about the increased levels of radioactivity, and that was the first inkling that something had gone horribly wrong in Russia and the Ukraine.
Right, so that's a really good indication of, I guess, the value of this, because you're getting, certainly in those days before 24-hour news, you were getting information way before it was, released to the press or anything like that.
Oh yes, it was a very well-run operation. It still is a very well-run operation. I keep talking about it in the past tense, but it's still very much with us. Back then, you had to be on time. Always had to be on time for your bulletin, otherwise you'd miss it and you might miss an important story. So so if you're not there at the top of the hour, you've got all sorts of questions to answer to your boss.
Right. And this was all shortwave broadcasts in the main, I presume.
After the first year or so of operating the computer, I became a technical operator, which was actually tuning the radios, pointing to satellite dishes, pulling in radio teletype broadcasts. All that sort of stuff was still going. It was absolutely fascinating. So you just sit there listening to shortwave radio for a whole 10, 12-hour shift.
Right. And presumably you had experts in those languages. You weren't just listening to their English language broadcasts.
Oh, yeah. We've had BBC Monitoring has a long history of language expertise. So we have a lot of emigres from the ex-Soviet Union covering Russian. We started off covering German and for the Second World War, but a lot of Russian speakers, Arabic speakers, with Persian speakers. So basically, covered the whole world, and we shared the world with our American equivalents and our Australian equivalents, and so we basically got full coverage of open source intelligence around the world.
Right. So you worked quite closely with, for example, the US Foreign Broadcast Information Service.
Oh yes, we did a lot of research for them. They would often send me somewhere in the world just to listen to radio and get some idea of what was going on, so that could be fed back to their operation.
Right. And so did you sort of like divvy up what countries to listen to, or did you sort of both listen to the same countries, or how did?
There was some divvying up, but there was also some overlap. So there's a lot of overlap in Russia, and some in the Far East. But we and not to mention Africa as well. We've got a listening station in Nairobi, but they also cover West Africa and Southern Africa.
Right. And presumably other NATO countries had similar organisations too.
Oh yes, they do. But we shared our output with our NATO partners. It was actually there's actually a government agreements for this, and there still are government agreements for this. But we also sell our output and analysis to them as well. So it's not just reporting the news as it turns up; it's also analysing what they're saying. So to give an idea to the intelligence services, to governments, to other news broadcasters, what the hell's going on in the world.
Right. And I don't know whether you'd be aware of this, but was there like a Soviet or an East German equivalent of BBC monitoring?
Absolutely certain there was. I mean, I don't think they've ever mentioned it, but we're absolutely certain there is the same coming the other way. Yeah,
no, I can imagine that open source intelligence is a valuable source of intelligence in itself. From that,
you could pretty much conclude that most major countries have their own operation.
Yeah. And with the Eastern Bloc countries, for example, do you think that there were attempts at disinformation because they knew that BBC monitoring service was listening in?
It's hard to tell at the time because we started off covering disinformation, which was stuff broadcast by Nazi Germany, knowing that we were listening. So we can imagine that carried on throughout the Cold War as well. We did notice, actually, there's actually parts of our archive in the open BBC Archive website where you can actually see some of the stuff we were covering and pointing out that this was actually broadcast misinformation, and that was from Reichssender from Germany. This undoubtedly carried on through the Cold War. There's obviously misinformation being broadcast.
Yeah, because I remember listening to Radio Moscow in the 1980s, and it was always great news, tractor production is up and stuff like that. It was never anything you'd be really interested in.
There's nothing. Yeah, I mean, my speciality now, as you probably know, is North Korea. And communists are going to communist. It's still very much tree planting is brisk and all that sort of thing.
Sounds like a code word somebody would use in a meeting with an agent.
Yeah, they actually have been sending out coding messages as well on Radio Pyongyang. So we have caught them at it, whether they're genuine or they're making up as they go along just to waste our time. That's another who knows.
That's interesting. So, and presumably the Soviet and Warsaw Pact countries used similar to transmit hidden messages to their agents.
Oh yeah. We can. I mean, a lot of my time spent when I was an operator was spent on the research bench because shortwave radio never stayed the same. They're always using new frequencies, always new sorts of stations popping up. And you could just drift off into the old number stations, which are a subject in themselves, which were...
Oh, yes. Absolutely. I'm looking to do an entire episode on the number stations. That is a subject in itself.
Absolutely fascinating. And if you listen to long enough, you can more or less tell which country they're coming from. We could direction find them as well to find out approximately where they were coming from. It was strange stuff.
Yeah,
and they all had their little nicknames.
Yeah, well, I use one of the East German number stations in the intro to the podcast with this robotic-sounding German lady.
Yes, the British one was known as Lincolnshire Poacher because it always played the same tune at the beginning.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Apart from cultural variations, how did Radio Moscow and the other Soviet bloc countries cater for broadcasting their messages from one language to another? So obviously Radio Moscow's English language message might be different to an Arabic or a German broadcast. Would that be the case?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, they did tailor their output. I can't remember how many languages they had were out at their peak, but dozens. Well, we were listening to Radio Moscow World Service 24 hours a day. They might just have 30 minutes in a little used Asian language or African language, which would just be plain news and the odd little feature. But it was all depending. Their messages were tailored to what the local politic was and who they were aiming it at. Even English language ones would change slightly depending which part of the world they were sending it to. Because they didn't. The way that shortwave video works, you beam to certain parts of the world at certain parts of the day, and then to another part of the day. So beaming to the US, say, and to Europe have slightly different messages.
Right. No, that's interesting. The sort of nuances around the propaganda that they're sending out, and it's interesting because you were talking about North Korea, and that is probably one of is probably the last outpost of sort of the Cold War to some degree, and it's still doing the same thing. So do they have English language broadcasts and broadcasts in other languages, or is their operation quite small?
Radio Pyongyang is one of the very few countries that still broadcast on shortwave. And the thing is about the propaganda and agitation department in North Korea and how it's outputs its message is that it will have one central script in Korean, and then translate it into all the different languages. There's all the different languages they're going to be broadcasting or publishing in, so that no matter who you are, where you are in the world, or what language you speak, you will get the same message as any other language. So it's all very strictly controlled as to what the message is, but there is only one message.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. Do you think that Radio Moscow and some of the other, Soviet era Eastern Bloc countries broadcasts were effective at all?
Yeah, they did have their following. I mean, not a huge following. The most people that actually listen to them in the more developed countries tend to be hobbyists, so they tend not to get people excited. Did you hear what they said in Radio Moscow last night? Yes, I did, comrade. Yes, that's not the sort of thing that the sort of conversation that they get in this country, because we're more developed and so probably a lot more cynical about what you hear on the radio. So they were preaching to the converted over here. Whether it's the same in other countries, it's hard to tell, but I presume that the message must have got through to people they were looking for. Yeah.
And did they use sort of forms of entertainment to get that message over? So did they do comedy shows and things like that to try and sort of soften the way they're pushing the message?
They were. There always used to be 8 minutes of news and then a commentary, and then they go off on their own programming. So there was often musical programs, but it wasn't the kind of music me as a 20, 30-something person would like to listen to. It was all pretty square stuff.
Yeah, that might have been the demographic they were aiming for. You never know.
Yeah. It's also interesting to see that now society's moved on, that Russia today is sort of trying to do the same thing, and it is actually finding an audience. It's actually being very careful in what it broadcasts, and so it's not all strictly looks like it's coming from Russia. It's even called RT just to get rid of the whole thing about it being Russian. So yeah, I mean, they've actually found a small audience of people who don't believe, who decide they don't want to believe what they see on domestic television in the UK. So it's strange that it seems to, after decades of broadcasting almost futilely to the UK, they found their way in television. Yeah, I mean, onto TV and cable and Freeview and all over the place. I mean, they have got direct pipe in. They've even got their own sort of video clipping agency, Rupley, which can then just get put into news bulletins free of charge. So that just spreads their name. It's very interesting and very successful the way they've done that. Yeah. Do you think that's as a result of some lessons they learnt during the Cold War? Oh yeah. I mean, they running dozens and dozens of shortwave transmitters was an enormous waste of money. Probably not the best use of resources. And they found, they found now that it's better to direct a message against dissatisfaction of politics in the UK and around Europe. And they seem to have learned their lesson that people need to be entertained as well as have information fed to them. Yeah, no, absolutely. So tell me about that infamous night in August 1991 that you mentioned to me. Yes. I was, 25 years old. I was working night shifts on the console at Caversham Park. Also on that night was a chap called Bob Harrison, who was at Crosley Park, which is our receiving station, and he was the guy who was tuning the radios. And also our Russian team, which on the past midnight to 6 o'clock shift was Janice Farrell, and she was there monitoring TASS news agency and anything which shows up on the television. Anyway, television comes on the air. It's not the news we were expecting. It was Swan Lake. And how are you, sorry, before you go any further, how are you picking up TV from Russia in Caversham Park? Yeah, I mentioned that 10-meter satellite dish. Ah, yeah. We got 5 of them. well, I think we're down to 4 at the moment, but yeah, because of all the moving about we're doing, we're now based in Broadcasting House, but 10-meter satellite dish aimed at an old Russian satellite, one of the Gorizont series, at 40 degrees east on the C-band, and we were getting Russian First Channel.
Wow. Okay.
At 2 o'clock in the morning, and one of the incredible things from that, they also broadcast their newspaper front pages, so you can get them out virtually on a fax machine. It had to be a big fax machine. Yeah, we get the newspaper front pages and all the inside pages, basically sent over a thing called newsfax and press fax, and so that was one of the bonuses of picking it up from satellite.
Right. So back to this balmy night in August. You're there with Bob and Janice, was it? And it's an ordinary night, and you're thinking, presumably that shift was the real graveyard shift where nothing normally happened, or did things normally happen?
Yeah. I mean, yeah. Usually, on the console, we'd have some really busy ones at the changing of the broadcast seasons, where we had to do lots of research. But this was just making sure that the TV channels, the satellites, are pointing at the right dishes, that we're getting reception where we're expecting reception from.
Right. So Swan Lake comes on, and you think, hang on, that's a bit strange.
Me and Bob have a talk, because there's also music on Radio Moscow when they should be doing news, and there's also music on the domestic services like Mayak and that sort of thing, where there should be news and everything. Oh ho, we've seen this before. It usually means that the leader's died or something unpleasant's happened. So,
and obviously with Chernenko and Andropov and all that flow of sudden deaths,
people keep falling over dead.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden we spring into life and just sit there waiting. And a couple of hours later, instead of the ballet goes on and the music goes on Radio Moscow, and we're thinking of getting the bosses out of bed, on comes all the announcements saying that Gorbachev's been deposed and a new council of ministers has been put in charge, and that went mad.
So what did you do that? Because up to that point you hadn't called anybody, I presume.
Well, we're all ready, and Janice got the print off from TASS news agency, which she typed in the spell. Yeah, you know what it's like when you're trying to type something in a hurry with the adrenaline flowing. That probably took longer to print out than anything else. But yes, so we literally buzzed it up to London. Start ringing up editorial staff to get them out of bed and say, you might like to come in now for your shift a lot earlier than expected. Sorry about that. And it was an absolute lunatic 4 or 5 hours in my life until the day shift came in.
Yeah. That must have been amazing to be the first in the West to hear.
Yeah, it was. I've still got a cassette of it. It's up in London at the moment. Yeah,
and that's how I found you, because you shared that on Twitter.
Yeah, I dare play the tape, and I have nothing to play it on at the moment, so I'm going to get it converted to MP3 just for the rest of the world.
Well, let us know when that happens. We will absolutely link to that. Now, you said you joined in 1989, so were you there when the wall opened, or? Yeah,
I was still a computer operator then, and I was sitting when the wall came down, I was sitting in a windowless room with a computer screen, categorizing Reuters news agency to the right addresses. So,
top job.
So basically, I saw the wall come down from a tiny little closet. As Reuters was coming in, I could see it all coming, and so that was So I didn't get to see much of that particular part of the Cold War, but then the next couple of years I'd switched over into the more operational side. Getting all our Eastern European stuff right was a real big part of the game for us.
In terms of pre the fall of the wall or post the fall of the wall while the changes were going on?
Yeah. I mean, we had. It's probably okay to say it now, but we had remote receivers in various parts of Eastern Europe. So we had receivers in Berlin, which you actually had to dial into and feed it down the telephone, and had receivers in the British Embassy in Stockholm, so we could listen to the Baltic stations from Vilnius and Tallinn,
right,
and Riga. And so, a big bank of receivers in Vienna, so we could hear all the Hungarian radio, Polish radio, Czech and Slovak radio. So we actually had receivers on the ground where we could
pick up the local broadcast directly.
Pick up local medium waves and FM stations, which was a real advantage to us, because it was literally like having receivers in the city at the time, when all hell was breaking loose. So that was really important. And also the same for the fall of Ceausescu. We could just pick up Romanian radio, and stations like that were just coming onto satellite as well. So the beginning of the 90s was like a real change in broadcasting, and it really made life a lot easier for us.
Oh, that's interesting that you were using the public phone line to dial into something that was picking up the local broadcast.
Oh, we had the same thing going in Yugoslavia when that was breaking up, because we couldn't actually. I mean, some of them we could hear on the internet. Internet rate streaming was just coming, but it really wasn't its infancy, and it was really terrible. And so we actually had people on the ground who we could literally phone them up, and they would put a tuned radio next to the telephone for the news bulletin.
That's brilliant.
And so we had the absolute lowest tech possible, and it worked. And it worked for us for years. And it's one of these things that we're really thankful that people actually put themselves out to be by their phone at 3:00 in the afternoon. So every now and then we get ring somebody up on their mobile, and they hadn't quite reached home yet. Then you can hear them running home to get the radio up for us, and it's absolutely remarkable, and we're really thankful for those people. And that really made a lot of difference.
No, that's amazing. So, I mean, obviously we've mentioned Moscow and the coup in 1991, that you were directly involved in the breaking of that. What other global events sort of stick in your memory from your time?
It's just been so much. I mean, I was also on the night shift when Osama bin Laden was killed.
Right.
But that was a bit. I did feel a lot more remote to that, because it all came out through the White House. But it was. I was actually. I'd actually moved away from the technical side, and that's after I became a journalist. So I was on the news desk night shift. I did a lot of night shifts. And so it was immediately from the news that he'd been killed in Pakistan, and then we're immediately looking out for reactions. But by that time, we moved away from broadcast a lot. So instead, it's on research on the internet. Have people in our Delhi office looking out for reaction from the Pakistan media, because they were somewhat indignant at the fact that America had been in there and
without telling them.
Without telling them first, yes.
I was going to ask you about things like South Africa and the release of Mandela and the changes there.
Yeah, that was sort of quieter for us because South Africa wasn't actually one of our countries. But so we did cover it. I wasn't actually on at the time, but I do remember it well. And then we were covering the whole changes in South Africa after that, which was just as important as his release. We did most of that through our partners, which was the Foreign Broadcast Information Service, which became Open Source Centre, which is now Open Source Enterprise.
Right. And now you've you've been working 15 years as a journalist, but you're still monitoring communist nations.
I mean, we still have a reasonably large operation. I mean, although Caversham Park closed last year, I've literally a year ago this week.
Apt timing. I'm speaking to you then, huh?
So we're now all up on the 6th floor of Broadcasting House, but we still have the broad scope at BBC Monitoring of watching Russia and Ukraine. We got really strong Russian Ukraine teams. We also watch Iran. I actually sit next to the Persian team. They're a great bunch, and we actually receive all the main Iranian television channels from satellite, so we can see what's basically going on there all the time.
And I presume with the technology now, some of this information is captured digitally, and it's trying to pick out keywords and things like that. Is that how the technology sort of moved?
Yeah, we still sort of use the good old-fashioned eyes in their head, because we've got people who've been watching this stuff for years and years and years, and they could tell a change of change of routine, just like that. Which is a lot of the stuff which I do. I've got one of my colleagues on the disinformation team I now work on. He uses data, and he uses big data, and he uses a lot of data, and he can analyze it straight away, and get interesting points there. I prefer to do it old style, just by watching stuff and seeing what the differences are.
Yeah, the Mark 1 eyeball.
The Mark 1 eyeball. Yeah, so we actually did something where we were tried to find out some information about, I can't remember what it was now, but we came to exactly the same conclusion at exactly the same time, using completely different approaches. So it works both ways, and it's good to be able to confirm things like that. Yeah. So we've got Persian team, we've got a Middle East Arabic team, and a sub team working directly looking at jihadist media, which is the big thing at the moment. It still is, even though Islamic State's sort of being beaten in Syria and Iraq, because there's still a thing over much of North Africa, West Africa, East Africa, and Asia. Yeah. It's not actually really my job anymore, but I still watch North Korean television every day.
How exciting is that?
It is not exciting. It's the amount of Cold War weaponry that's on display still on North Korean television: MiG-15s and MiG-21s, and old Sukhoi fighters and everything, old Soviet tanks. So yeah, if you can find North Korean television, and it is on the internet now. There is actually a live stream.
You'll have to share the link if you can find the link. It sounds like something for my insomnia.
Unfortunately, it doesn't come on the air till 6 a.m.
That might be a good time.
For the time difference, it's from about 6 a.m. till about 2 p.m. But yeah, if you love Cold War weaponry, you're never more than a few minutes away from a old Russian tank.
Right. Well, you've got to send me the link to that. That sounds great. Well, that's it for this episode. However, there's links to further information, including videos, in the show notes, which are at coldwarconversations.com/episode and the number 73. Now, I am putting together a special 30th anniversary episode on the fall of the Berlin Wall. So if you have any accounts you'd like to share on the show, do email me at ian@coldwarpod.com. That's ian@coldwarpod.com. And if you can think of anybody who has a great story to share, then do put them in contact with me. Don't forget you can support us and get a Cold War Conversations coaster at patreon.com/coldwarpod. That's patreon.com/coldwarpod. If you like what you're hearing in the podcast, you can really help us by leaving reviews on iTunes or where you found this podcast. This really helps raise our profile and get new guests on the show. If you can't wait for the next episode, do visit our Facebook discussion group where guests and listeners just like you continue the Cold War conversation. Just search for us in Facebook. We're also on Twitter at Cold War Pod. Thank you very much for listening. It is really appreciated. Goodbye.